I'm so glad that you're listening in on this because we as a church need to go after something. In fact, I would say it's rooted in misunderstanding, misperception, misrepresentation, confusing, weird, crazy. It's just what we're going to talk about has been abused, and just many of us feel insecure about it. Prayer, all locations, fellows at RCMU, East, West, everyone online. We've got to talk about prayer because I think some of us are unsure about it, weirded out about it. Some of us, maybe many of us, maybe a good majority of us aren't even engaged in it, and we're just like, I don't know. So here's all I want to do. I want to talk about it in a way that I think if we miss what we're going to talk about, then we miss something so crucial and critical to just God. Prayer. Prayer is a huge deal, and I don't know what your perceptions are of prayer, but whatever they are, if you would be willing, if you would be so kind to just set them down for a moment, and let's look at what the Bible has to say about prayer, about what it looks like to have these conversations with God. If you'd set it down, well, we can begin to lean into some stuff. A guy named Paul, well, he wrote letters to different churches, and in one letter in particular, he wrote something to them, to that church specifically, that I think if he were still writing letters, he probably would write a similar letter to us. And let me show this to you. Devote yourselves to prayer. This is to a church being watchful and thankful. And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Now, you would expect the guy writing a church to say, hey, you should pray. But can I show you this first word? I think kind of messes us up. Devote. Think about your interpretation, your current interpretation of devote. I think we would all come up with what it looks like to be devoted to something, to actually find yourself in devotion to another person or another thing. Maybe you should say, I'm devoted to my family, my work, but I think we're misunderstanding when we're even in the Bible, or when I talk to you like, hey, a pastor says, you should devote yourself to prayer. And be like, is he meaning that I'm supposed to spend 2 to 3 hours a day on my knees praying? And I don't know if you ever found yourself going, what would I even talk to God for 3 hours about? And life gets hectic. And I think the word devote, for many of us, we're not sure about. I would tell you, but first, the word devote is crucial to your walk with God. The word devote is absolutely critical to your walk with God. But now I just said another weird phrase, walk with God. You're like, walk with God? Like, walk with God? Walk with God's weird? To say, hey, how's your walk with God? If you're like, I don't say that, hey, how's your walk with your wife? How's your walk with your husband? How's your walk with your friend? You don't say that. And if you do, that's a little weird. How's your walk with, we say this about God, though. How's your walk with God? And if you ever hear that, I think it's a good phrase, but you got to understand the phrase. And the phrase is asking, how's your connectedness to God? How's your journey with God? How's your relationship with God? And when someone says, how's your walk, they're saying, in other words, this relationship with God should be going somewhere, progressing, getting deeper, better, stronger, healthier. And so that's why if you're around church much, you're probably going to hear someone say, how's your walk with God? They're asking you, how's the health of your relationship with God? And when this says, devote yourself to prayer, which prayer is simply a conversation with God. I think he's getting after our walk with God. He's saying that if you want to walk with God in a healthy way, you need to be devoted to God. Deeper, you need to be devoted to conversations with God. So I bring you back. I'm not sure we know what devoted conversations with God look like, feel like, how long they should be, how often they should be. What should I recite something? Can I talk about what I want to talk about? Is he listening? And I think so when we say devote yourself, we're confused. So I thought we should spend some time inside a story. It really happened. If you go back in our nation's history, 1940s or 1840s. If you go in the 1840s, you're going to find something, if you study this, that we were in a situation as a nation that was not good. Maybe you'll even remember recent days and how they're connected. At that time, in the 1840s, our economy was tanking. It's horrible. Let me give you some examples. The railroad was going bankrupt. Banks were closing. Factories were closing. Thousands upon thousands of people were losing their jobs. Racism and slavery specifically had become such a hot topic that if you know your history, in that time frame, it appeared to be that our nation was on its way to a civil war. There was crazy going on all over the place, governmentally, economically, but even spiritually. Here's what was going on in the 1840s with church. Pastors, preachers were telling everybody that Jesus was coming back like within days in the 40s. And obviously the days they would predict, they would say, Jesus is coming back. That day would arrive and everyone would be like, where is he? And it began to create a disillusionment with people that go, not just disillusioned with our government and life, and they were disillusioned with God. Churches were dying. Our history, this is a rough time. If you walk through, though, in rough times, there's moments, aren't there? You've had them. You've had rough moments in your life where some good began to happen. I want to tell you about some good that began to happen. If you go from the 40s into the 50s of that era, you're going to find that a recession began in our nation, and people began to lose jobs at faster rates. In fact, all the way to 1857, in that year, over 5,000 businesses closed. The recession was launching. And if you zoom into lower Manhattan in New York, this was like so easy to see. People were leaving, scrambling what to do with life. A church in lower Manhattan during all of this horrible time, a church was dying as well. It could hardly survive. A church was wondering what even, a lot of churches had closed their doors, had been like, we're done, and moved on, and there was a particular church in lower Manhattan who they needed a pastor. They didn't have a pastor. And so they began to look for a pastor, but they couldn't really find a pastor. So they found a guy named Jeremy Lanphier, who wasn't really trained as a pastor. He loved God, but he wasn't really trained as a pastor. They said, will you be our pastor? And he's like, well, sure. They offered him $1,000 for the whole year. They said, will you lead our church that's dying? He agreed to it. And in the first 3 months on the job, he went everywhere. I don't know if you know, he went everywhere to houses, to businesses, to factories. He went everywhere that he could. And what he did is he would introduce people, say, hey, I'm a pastor of a church now. We would like for you to join us at our church. And we're going to talk about God and worship God. And we'd love for you to come. And he spent the first 3 months doing this. And nothing happened. Nothing. 3 months, nothing. He tried to get the church itself, like the people in the church, the Christians. Hey, we need to have enthusiasm about God. We need to be devoted to God. And they were like, just come visit us and just preach and do your thing. We don't really care. After 3 months, he was pretty discouraged. Like I said, everything around him was crashing. The church was dying. So he had what he might have considered a final resort. What he said, well, okay, if the church people don't care about God much and no one else, then we're just going to start a prayer meeting. If that's a new term to you, prayer meeting, it's simply he was going to get a room and invite people to the room, and they were just going to talk to God in the same room with each other and just talk to God. So he planned it. He made printouts and passed and distributed them, made signs. In fact, there was a sign that he set out that many people saw. It literally said prayer meeting, noon to 1 o'clock, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, come as you want. You could show up and leave. You didn't have to pray the whole time. And he put the sign up, and he advertised like crazy. He was awesome at it. And then it came the day. It was in September of the year. He went up to the third floor. Noon came. No one showed. Not a single person. 12:10. No one but him. Yay. 12:20. No one but him. 12:30. He began to hear the creaking of the stairs as someone was walking up the stairs. And I think a bit encouraged at the time, like, well, one person's coming. And that person came up. He's like, well, I've come to the prayer meeting. And then a little bit later, another person arrived, and they waited for everyone to show up. By the time it ended, 6 people showed up to a prayer meeting. By the time the 6th person showed up and they decided to pray, there was hardly any time left because 1 o'clock was almost there. So they prayed just for a short time. But it was meaningful to them, and they agreed that the next Wednesday they would get together and do the same thing. The next Wednesday came. 20 people came this time, not 6. They prayed together. The next Wednesday came. 40 people came, not 20. In fact, there began to be a bit of a enthusiasm about talking to God, devoting to God, and they said, hey, instead of every Wednesday, what about every day? What if we put this to every day? What they did not know was what was about to happen. They decided in that meeting, hey, next week we'll start every day. Well, next week, stock market crashed. And if it had seemed destitute before then, that created mayhem all over our nation, but very specifically in Lower Manhattan. People began to be so afraid. And what they did when they were afraid, all those invitations they had received, they're like, well, let's go to that church. Over the course of time, and when I say over the course of time, over a couple of weeks, it went from 6 people, 20 people, 40 people, to after the stock market crashed and people began to show up, 3,000 people started to fill that church building. I think it's important to see this. You notice that no one's preaching. Their heads are bowed, and what they would do is they would show up and pray. 3,000 people. They had to find extra rooms in the church for enough people to get into the different spots, and they would gather and pray. Pray. You're like, but what was the program? No, they just prayed. Now, some of us are like, oh, I bet I know that. And you're like, pastors can tell us we got to devote to pray. This is what walking with God means, and this is why I don't think we understand what this means. So I thought I'd help you understand what this means, because you need to know they had to make a rule. I don't know if you like rules. I don't particularly love rules, but I thought I'd read to you the rules they had to post. I think it might mess with your understanding of what's going on. Rule 1, brethren are earnestly requested to adhere to the 5-minute rule. If you don't know what that means, they articulate it a little bit more. Prayers and exhortations not to exceed 5 minutes in order to give all an opportunity. If you're misunderstanding, get what I'm saying. It means that these 3,000 people that were gathering in the church who were going, I don't know what to do with life. I'm confused, so I'm gonna seek God. I'm gonna try to walk with God. So they show up to the church, and there's this prayer meeting. No preaching, no singing. No, they just like we're just gonna pray. And there became a rule that you could only come for 5 minutes. No joke. If you don't know that time, that means you'd leave wherever you came from, hitch your horse up to the outside, you'd go inside. 5 minutes is all you had to pray, because you had to leave or make some room so someone else could come in and pray. 5 minutes. People would come and pray for 5 minutes, and they would leave. And God began to do things. God did. It's estimated that within 6 months of the first 6-person prayer meeting, that 10,000 people in New York City, a town at that time of 800,000 people, 10,000 of them were finding places to devote to God, to conversations, to pray to Him. 5 minutes. But then it spread. In fact, this was going on so much the newspaper said, what's going on? They did an article on what was going on. Because people were not only just showing up to pray, they were curious people who didn't even follow Jesus. And they were showing up going, what are you guys doing? And they would show up and they would be like, what's going on? And by the time they left, they decided to follow Jesus. Multiple stories of a guy who actually showed up intending to kill a woman and then commit suicide. Shows up, does neither, gives his life to Jesus, decides to follow Jesus. No preaching. Praying. Multiple people who were notorious thieves got saved. Businessmen showing up who had devoted themselves to just getting as much money from people got saved and decided to do things differently. People's hearts were being changed. They had no expectation of that change. After the newspaper sent the article out and people began to read about it, it spread to other major cities, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, even to Washington, D.C., all the way to the East Coast. There's lots of different estimates about what played out during that time. Many have said it's the last great American revival. If the word revival is new to you too, revival means something was being revived. What was being revived were people deciding to follow Jesus Christ, deciding to not live this dead kind of lifestyle or selfish kind of lifestyle, devote themselves to Jesus. And there was this revival of that spreading all over the nation. In fact, estimates are that over 1 million people in the 2 years that this went on, over 1 million people decided to follow Jesus. Now that we have enough time removed between that era in the 1800s to now, they actually can track back. And some sociologists and people who have studied history say this, no joke, that they say 1/13 of all Christians in the United States of America right now could find their roots of Christianity back to that moment. Multiple denominations and multiple rescue missions, multiple good in this world has happened out of that moment. And you track back millions. We start to use millions. We even get disconnected from like millions. I don't even relate to millions and thousands, but you relate to 6. You definitely relate to 1. And when I read to you something, devote yourselves to prayer, many of us are like, I don't got time for that. You don't got 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Do you see what God can do with 5 minutes? Pastor Jeremy, he knew something. It didn't click for a little bit. Like I told you, he started off doing things his way, going about it his way and what he thought was best. But then it changed at about 3 months in, and he knew something needed to change. He knew something about walking with God. He knew something about a journey with God, a connectedness to God, a relationship with God. He knew something. And you and I need to know this. Walking with God involves talking with God. It seems so basic. However, I think a good majority of us are neglecting this. I mean, I'm not asking you to think about the person next to you or around you. I'm talking about you. Walking with God, connecting to God, being with God, it requires talking. And I know you're like, well, yeah, of course. But many of us have abandoned this. And the only time that we talk to God is out of complete desperation. There's no relationship there because we rarely talk to Him, only in the heightened moments, the 911 moments. Walking with God involves talking with God. Let me show you something. Because if you don't know who you're talking to, I think it's important. Oh, sovereign Lord, you made the heavens and earth by your strong hand and powerful arm. Nothing is too hard for you. You show unfailing love to thousands, but you also bring the consequences of one generation's sin upon the next. You are the great and powerful God, the Lord of heaven's army. Oh, sovereign Lord. When you decide, I'm going to devote to God, I'm going to devote some time to prayer, conversations with God, you need to know who you're talking to. You're talking to the sovereign God. Sovereign. If you don't know what sovereign means, I can break it down. It's basically two words combined to create a word. It means supreme and rule, a supreme being, someone who's above all, better than all, elite, supreme, and rules over all. When you and I have this conversation about prayer, what's prayer? What's prayer? It's a conversation with the sovereign God, the supreme ruler of all. And many of us are not going to God as a sovereign God, we're going to Him as a last resort. Can we admit that? That He's become a last resort? Like where you do all your stuff and your things and you go into your own motions and circumstances and decisions of the day, but if you have a last resort moment, then you go to God. You don't treat Him like a sovereign God, the supreme ruler. He's the last resort. Many of us, just think about it, if you're trying to solve your problems and you skip God, you skipped your best option. If you went about trying to resolve a relationship or trying to live life with purpose and you skipped God, you skipped your best option because He's the supreme rule. In fact, this links to how Jesus even taught us to pray. It's a big deal. Here's how Jesus said, oh, you don't know how to pray? Here's how to pray. Our Father in heaven, may your name be kept holy. May your kingdom come soon. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. May your will be done on earth. May your will be done on earth. May your will be done on earth. That oozes, God, you're my first option, my best option, and I want you to be involved, so I need to devote myself to conversations with you. But I think we need to address something. Because some of us are like, I have been devoting myself to prayer. I have been talking to God. I have been going to God with the stuff you're talking about, Pastor David. I've gone to Him. I've asked Him to intervene, the supreme ruler of all. I've gone to Him. I left disappointed. Has God ever chosen to not do what you asked Him to do? Has God ever done something that you asked Him not to do? Have you ever found yourself hearing, oh, God's my best option, He's all powerful, but boy, am I disappointed in Him. Ooh, some of you are even uncomfortable with that idea of saying, I can't be disappointed in God. I mean, He's awesome. Yes, He is awesome. But if it's a real relationship, you have to leave room for disappointment. I found myself multiple times disappointed with God. I remember when Katie and I we got engaged, and I was looking for a job, and I had no job, and I would pray every morning, God, would you help me today find a job? And I would go disseminate resumes and go all over looking for, and here you go, and nothing. I would pray in the afternoon, God, morning didn't go well. Then evening, God, tomorrow would you provide that job? I spent 6 months looking for a job, praying every single day, every afternoon, every evening. God, would you? And our savings account depleting over time, getting lower and lower and lower and lower to nearly nothing. And I'm like, God, I'm disappointed in you. My mom has struggled with health issues for quite some time now. I have prayed more times than I can remember. I've written my prayers. I've cried out my prayers. I've screamed them. I've cried them. God, would you just heal her? Would you just literally heal her body? And to this point, nothing. And I find myself, I don't know if you're willing to admit this, I find myself in days and moments where I'm disappointed with God, but I know I'm supposed to talk to Him, devote to Him, go to Him, lean in on Him. I have conversations, prayer, devoted prayer, and many of us are letting our disappointment wreck the relationship. If you allow disappointment to constantly wreck every relationship, you're going to eventually have no relationships whatsoever. Many of us are using God. If you're unwilling to be disappointed by him, you're using him. And I've had a coach, multiple pastor coaches in my life. Kevin Myers is one of them, and he said this one time that really messed with me, really humbled me. If you're disappointed with God, you don't have his perspective. Some of you are even offended by this. You're like, how dare you say that? But it's true. If you're disappointed with God, you don't have his perspective. And in fact, you and I have got to grapple with this, that God sees more than we see. What he knows is best is often what we do not know. If you're disappointed with God, it's okay to be disappointed with God, but don't stay there and let it wreck the relationship. Recognize that you don't see what he sees. Many of us are disappointed when healing doesn't happen, right? I mean, you're like me. Do you find it fascinating that you and I get disappointed in God when he doesn't heal a person and he lets them go to heaven early? Do you think it's weird that we get disappointed when someone gets to go to heaven early? We're disappointed for them and ourselves when it's perspective, is it not? It's perspective. Do you think earth is better than heaven? I'm not saying that. I want my mom to be healed. I want anyone in your life to be healed. I don't want to lose people early, but I've got to have the perspective that if they don't get healed and they go to heaven, then that's awesome for them. But many of us, our disappointment has wrecked the relationship, so we've stopped devoting. And I just feel like this sermon about prayer, yeah, we're going to go to some practical here in a minute, but you got to know that you can't let the disappointing conversations, one, be ignored saying, yeah, I'm totally cool with everything he's doing. No, you're not. But you've got to understand that your perspective could be skewed and his is not. So walk out of this. Let me teach you a couple things here. My disappointment doesn't change God's sovereignty. You know, we talked about sovereignty, his supreme rule. My disappointment doesn't change that. No matter what I think about God, it does not change the fact that God is sovereign and that he has an awesome perspective and that he is perfect. He is amazing. It doesn't change it. In fact, God's unchanging. My disappointment doesn't change God's love. It doesn't change God's heart. It doesn't change God's goodness. Many of us are allowing our disappointments to ruin so many relationships, and one very specifically, the one with God. Some of you, I know you're like, God's good, but he let this happen, or he didn't stop that. Sometimes it's easy to trust God's goodness. If the money's good, if the health's good, if the opportunities are good, if you've gotten some of your wish list lately, it's good. But then there's moments that you're in a storm of life. Let me teach you something about this a little bit further. God's goodness is always worth trusting. And I want to emphasize this. Sometimes you have to trust it because you don't see it. Right? Have you ever done, you have done this with other people, that even though you didn't see something in them, you trusted that it would be in them. Even though you're like, well, I don't know, I haven't seen you do this, or I'm insecure in this, or I have some fears, but you've trusted. Sometimes when you don't see God's goodness, you just got to know you can trust that it's there because he doesn't change and he's promised it. In fact, let me show you this in the Bible. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Works for the good. You may not see it, but you can trust it. Who have been called according to his purpose. When you decide to devote yourself to conversations with God, you can change, the world around you can change. Don't let your disappointment or questioning of him change your conversations. Continue. If you're right now going, I'm struggling with him, continue to talk with him. In fact, maybe you don't even know how to talk to him. Be like, what's that look like? What's it look like to even talk to God? Like, how's that play out? Like, what's that even visually look like? I can give you, and it's hard to talk about a relationship in terms of words, right? But I can give you two pieces that I've learned. The first, conversations with God, devoting to God in prayer can be mechanical, and it ought to be. There should be a mechanical facet to it. Structure, discipline. Many of us are lacking this right now. We have no structure or discipline to it. This applies to really any relationship. With my relationship with Katie and my kids, there's some structure and discipline to it because it helps foster other things. A relationship with God, devotion, prayer with God requires some specificity, some discipline, some whether I feel like it or not, I'm going to do it, and here's how often I'm going to do this. It requires some of the mechanical. But that's not the only part, because that creates a pretty dry relationship if that's all that exists. You also need the mysterious. That's incredibly difficult for me to share with you because it's mysterious. The mysterious is the intimate part, the passionate part, oftentimes the unpredictable part. But if you want to know what should your time with God, your walk with God, your prayer time with God look like? Well, there should be some mechanical to it and some mysterious to it. For some of you, your version of prayer is kind of getting messed up right now. So let me clarify. I think this clarifies. Prayer isn't something we do, it's someone we walk with. I've learned this also from multiple mentors in my life, and I've experienced it in my own life. Many of us treat it like something to do. Perhaps you've been like, I've got to say this at this certain time in this certain way, and it becomes something that you're doing, and only that you're doing, and not someone that you're walking with, connecting to, like literally living life with. Prayer isn't something we do. It's someone. There's someone on the other line. And so, if you find yourself in the mechanical or the mysterious, there's ways you have to combat this. So, if you're struggling with just mechanical, if you're a mechanical person where you're just like everything has to happen at certain times in certain ways, I'm saying that because I'm often one of those people that gets very mechanical with life. Then here's some things that you might want to consider putting into your conversations with God. Prayer walks, where you just walk in the hills or around your neighborhood and just listen. Embrace some quiet. Maybe turn the music off, the TV off, the computer off, and just let the quiet happen, not in a mechanical way, but let God just press in on you. This is difficult for many of us. We're refusing this. If you're more of the mysterious, mystical person, let me show you what you need to work on. Discipline daily time. Many of us don't, we refuse any kind of rhythm, so we get completely out of rhythm, and we have no connection because we're just waiting for randomness rather than intentionality. And Jesus taught us intentionality is a big deal. Discipline daily time. Written list. Written literally, I have these written list of prayers to God that I've written, like praying specifically for each one of our kids, for Katie, for you, for our church, for my family, for me personally. Written lists. It's a big deal. Creating some sort of a rhythm, some sort of a predictability to those conversations. Pastor Jeremy showed us that a devotion to prayer, it's not crazy, but it is powerful. I want you to consider changing the way you do your days and your weeks. If you've ever been desperate for God to intervene in your life, to do something in your life, or maybe just for a closeness, as though God were walking with you, by you, if you've ever craved that, and you're like, how do I get that? Is that more sermons, more church time, I tell you, devote yourself to prayer. Devote yourself to conversations with God. And you will find yourself discovering an intimacy, a passion, an authenticity to your relationship with your Creator. Prayer. You need it. It's powerful. And I would say everyone around us needs you to start praying. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for letting us get to have conversations with you. God, I feel like we've kind of outed ourselves in the midst of this. For many of us, for the first time, being willing to at least mentally admit that we're disappointed in some things. God, for those who are wrestling with disappointment, Lord, would you help them know that you still love them? I know you do that constantly, but would you reaffirm that? Lord, for those of us who are wrestling with disappointment, if any of us have ever abandoned the relationship, we're sorry. Lord, help us to be a group of people that decides each day to walk with you, to be connected to you, to go further with you. Lord, in this series, help us to have open hearts, willing to examine our conversations with you, our time with you, our devotion to you. We love you, Lord. We ask that you would do a work in our own souls and in the lives of everyone around us. We invite, God, you to do a revival amongst us so that more and more people would know who you are. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.